Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I think we'd like to get started. I'm sure we will have a few joining us, and apologies in advance for them having to climb over you to find the few remaining available seats. But I think it's always good to have the problem of too few rather than too many in terms of coming for these chats. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name is Geoff Dabelko. I have the good fortune to direct our Environmental Change and Security program, and one that is a program that tries to get some of these different worlds together, I think reflected by who's around the table here and some of the topics that we'll hear today in terms of environment, health, development, foreign policy, security policy, issues of conflict, issues of peace. And hopefully we will hit on all those today in some respect. The Wilson Center itself, let me just say a word because I see a few new faces. This is actually the formal memorial to Wilson. And so Congress thought it appropriate to have a living memorial where reflecting his legacy as both scholar and politician to bring these worlds together to learn from one another. So instead of playing tourist in front of a monument across the street at the mall, we can come together in dialogue on a nonpartisan, non-advocacy basis. And so the Center's been doing that since 1968. Our particular program has been doing it since 1994, where kind of coming out of the Cold War, there was perceived need in both the research side and the policy side to have a forum where these different communities could come together, communities that don't speak the same language often, don't necessarily or didn't necessarily think they were paying attention to some of the same issues, but it turned out that there were some common interests in some issues, ones that we'll talk about today. And so we've tried to provide a forum in convening, in publications that I hope you'll pick up, in an active web and internet presence, including doing things like webcasting, which we're doing today, and trying to facilitate this dialogue here in Washington and here in the United States, but importantly with communities outside the United States. In the research world and in the policy practice world. So that's what we're about here at the Center, and that's what we're about today. With a focus, I see some faces of folks who've been involved in this back in the late 80s and early 90s, where there was a lot of intense interest around environment and security. So coming out of the Cold War is how do these global issues fit or not fit into a broader foreign and security policy context? And in the 90s, there wasn't a whole lot of discussion of climate change. The perception was that it was longer term, incremental, and it didn't have some of the immediacy effects that some of the changes in availability of natural resources might have in playing in connection to violent conflict. So it was seen as outside the debate. Well, that is clearly not the case now. For a variety of reasons, obviously climate change and energy issues are above the fold. In positive ways and obviously in negative ways. And it is the primary avenue into this environmental security discussion that is links between climate and security, real, perceived, debated, discussed, certainly no consensus on it, but it's the way that we come into many of these discussions. And so it has been framed in many ways by many different actors, a number of players, and you would not get necessarily a consensual list on even how those links are present. But I think it's fair to say that much of that discussion has been on what are the anticipated climate change impacts, how might they contribute to instability or conflict or vulnerabilities without necessarily coming to the higher thresholds of violent conflict, but what are both the kind of direct impacts of anticipated climate change, then maybe also focus on some of the reactions to that. So if you have a sea level rise scenario, those would be direct impacts. The people migrating would be a secondary impact or response to that change, and then how that plays into a security, stability, a conflict frame from a variety of different angles, again, not with a singular definition of what the issues are. And those are all very important, and those are certainly foundations for what we're discussing today, and we will, I'm sure, in both our roundtable discussion and the questions that we have, we will get to those issues. But part of what we're trying to do today is actually then go an additional step to a set of topics that are loosely defined, certainly not defined, but we have kind of a laundry list that we'd like to kind of talk through in some ways as a way to try to tease out where there may be evidence or even just a deductive argument about the potential for conflict or the potential for cooperation from our policy responses to this climate change and energy set of challenges. And so what is the conflict or the peace potential of our attempts to mitigate climate change? What are the peace building or conflict potentials of how we try to adapt to climate change? So in this way, I don't know whether it's a third or a fourth order or some other order altogether response to climate change, but it is examining our variety of basket of responses, policy responses, the social, political, economic responses to climate change in trying to address it head on, and how that fits into this broader security frame. And so that's what we're trying to do today. So I wanted to draw that distinction in terms of, in part, the history, and in part, that there are still many unsettled questions about those first and second order questions of how climate change, energy questions may impact security, but then suggest that what we're trying to do is even go a step further and think through some of it kind of future, because I think we would certainly have people in the room, and certainly in the front of the room, saying that, you know, come back to me when we are actually serious about mitigation and adaptation, and then we can talk about these issues. But nevertheless, as we engage and make really big decisions about how we do that, for us, it was an issue of, well, okay, what does this mean in our conflict potential, in our cooperation potential, peace potential, and how do we want to tackle that? So that's what we're about today. We have three distinguished panelists who are visiting us here in town, all of whom have been very active on these issues for many, many years from very different angles. And so in that sense, instead of having them give what is their variety of stock presentations or telling us about their brand new research, we said we got their books out there, so you can buy their books on what they're doing. We're going to challenge them a little more and have them go off the cuff in responding to some questions on this topic, in part because it's newer and there's not a whole lot written about it, but also then can engage in some debate among themselves. So to my right is Dr. Stacy VanDeveer. He's professor of political science at the University of New Hampshire, has had done time. I don't know if that's done time at Harvard and at Brown and at IASA and places like that, and the kind of blessing and curse of some of those worlds. And so Stacy has tackled these issues from a variety of perspectives. Lots of work on global environmental institutions, lots of work on how that fits into larger political context. Has a new book with Henrik Selin that you can get out there looking at climate change cooperation in the North American context. And as someone that, all the way back to graduate school, I've really depended on in helping me formulate my thinking about these issues. So it's terrific that Stacy can join us. Cleo Paskal is it has the kind of same number of multiple posts with all the advantages that comes with it. Trained as a journalist, Canadian, so has a home base in Canada, but also affiliated with Chatham House, and so is in the UK, but rarely is in one place for very long, in part because she's got a new book called Global Warring out that she's been on tour kind of all over the world for, and has had opportunity to talk to a lot of folks. Spends some months of every year teaching in India, and so has had some really interesting conversations and insights on some of the geopolitical perspective on looking at Copenhagen through Chinese and Indian eyes and understanding larger geopolitical context. And so we will turn to her for insights on these issues as well. And again, the book is out front. And then finally, Alexander Carius is the co-director and founder of Adelphi Research in Berlin. Somebody who, if you want to know what's going on in environment security, climate security in the European context, is the first person you should call. He has been working these issues often in backstopping and working with and trying to cajole into action big institutions like the German government from multiple ministries, the European Union, NATO, a variety of different contexts where he's been working on these issues and has that similar arc of understanding over the years how it's played out. He and his colleagues have a variety of different research products that are specifically really meant for the policy context to do something with the research and analysis. And so it's terrific that he can bring some of the insights from the European work that he has done to that. So I'm gonna stop my monologue here and throw out a couple of questions and jump into it. Again, wanting to have both the conflict and the cooperation potential in what we're looking at. And so in some ways, as you might have seen on the invitation, we posed a variety of questions, some of which tracked with different alternative renewable types or the strategic minerals and such. But one of the more one of the cases where we've seen some evidence, or what folks would claim as evidence, is the question on biofuels. And so maybe we can start with Alex talking a little bit about biofuels. If the way that that's come into this discussion has been the EU passes a transportation target requiring 10% on renewables by 2020, what impact does that have in terms of sourcing some of those renewables, in terms of palm oil plantation, food rights, energy crisis, a lot of stuff mixed up together. But Alex, your take on that as an example of these issues and the various EU responses that have or haven't come to this issue.
Thank you, Geoff. Thank you for inviting me. And I would like to pick up one idea that you raised in the beginning. So is it better to discuss adaptation and mitigation strategies and their likely foreign policy and security impact when we have agreed upon what we actually want to do? And my clear answer would be no. And when we have learned something from the past few years where major international organizations, the UN, the European Commission, OSCE, and a couple of others, commissioned a series of reports to learn about the likely security implications of climate change, I observe at the moment that they had very little impact, if at all they had one impact. And we're not talking about just commissioned reports, but we talk about more firm commitment of governments to coordinate their work on that subject in Europe under a roadmap process that was initiated and guided under the auspices of the European Council and the European Commission. We have an equivalent at the UN, where we had the UN Secretary General presenting a so-called comprehensive report on the basis of a General Assembly resolution on likely security implications. And so that is my concern, that we put a lot of effort in demonstrating security implications, and we are discussing them broadly with stakeholders. But in the end, it is at least difficult to find any kind of shift that is made. So I guess it's the right time, really, to address these questions. And as you mentioned, biofuels and the biofuel debate going on in Europe, I think it's a good example of setting a target, in that case, a 10% share of renewable energies in fuels by the year 2020, without really thinking through whatever secondary, third or fourth order consequences of that. And the idea is basically there were a lot of concerns raised that basically the promotion of biofuels in the developing world will have tremendous effects on food security by basically replacing crops that are needed for livelihood security there. And the question is, and that's my take on that, without going into further detail, to look whether that has an implication and whether the thinking of secondary effects on both in development policy terms and foreign policy terms led to a shift. And I guess this is a good example that it did not lead to a shift in terms of redefining the target. The target is the same, and I guess it's very unlikely that the European Commission or the European Union come up with a target that they revise after a few years. But it's quite interesting that just today the European Commission published a series of recommendations and communications on introducing a certification scheme for biofuels. I think that is a clearer indication that they at least take the entire debate very serious. Whether we have thought through the entire impacts that this would have on the agricultural sector in developing countries, I think it's too early really to assess this, because the European Union have chosen an approach of commissioning 4 major studies. They presented one in March this year on different aspects, also on different regional foci that they had. But I guess it was a quite interesting example to rethink. And with regard to mitigation and adaptation measures after Copenhagen, I mean, there were expectations that we can discuss maybe here when we planned this roundtable, or when you planned this roundtable, to discuss already some sort of outcome of Copenhagen, and then go through and and make a short assessment or evaluation of that, is that that what I see is that security implications and security considerations when it comes to mitigation and adaptation is not at stake. At least I don't see that within European member states, government discussions, with maybe a slight exception in the UK and a slight exception last year with the German government and the Swedish government under their presidency, where they were pushing a more comprehensive review of climate change issues under security and foreign policy considerations. But it is much more prevailing, and the concerns from NGOs in the development policy area about unintended effects.
I was going to push you, because you mentioned here in an earlier conversation about perhaps the example of some learning going on in the plans for regional solar as an alternative renewable. Can you say a word about whether there's a prospect of the biofuels having been a learning experience in thinking about some of these social implications up front?
Yeah, I guess there is some parallel in looking at large-scale technology options in the renewables area of developing a program that is called Desertec, which is the promotion of solar energy in North Africa to satisfy demands in Europe for energy imports. And the way I see that is that when this was announced by major companies and a foundation was set up in order to promote the idea of large-scale infrastructure building on renewables, that there were great enthusiasm in the beginning that was then shifted towards a lot of skepticism whether the countries where they actually want to implement this large-scale technology option would be in favor of that. And the way the German government, and not only the German government, but in the partners, which are partly private, partly public, handle this is that they are very careful in introducing that and rolling it out in the countries, both in terms of informal settings of workshops, etc., and of course informal consultations, but also in the form of larger conferences. One is just in the next few days coming up in Casablanca, the so-called Casablanca Forum, where the idea of large-scale renewable infrastructure is introduced, but not necessarily just under the label of Desertec, which is one heavy investment there, but to have a more general a platform or a forum to exchange ideas and concerns about that. And I guess that indicates already a certain sensitivity that is built on at least the entire idea of large-scale infrastructure, be it on renewables or non-renewables.
So, you know, in some ways, and Stacy, perhaps for you, in some ways, some of the not thinking about these third and fourth order effects is understandable if the frame that we're seeing for those who want to address climate change is that the green economy, the lower carbon economy, bending the curve on carbon emissions is kind of uniformly a good thing, and all good things flow from that. Is that a frame that serves us well for looking at some of these questions, and have we thought through the implications of those assumptions?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting set of questions, because my own sense of this is that if we think about the kinds of energy sources in our sort of green energy future that we imagine and we talk about a lot, it seems to me that we talk about fairly dramatically scaling up a whole set of markets, and the record of boom and bust and in the sort of the whole resource curse literature and the countries to whom the term is often applied is pretty poor. And so one of the things that about these connections that really seems to me to be that we're struggling with is how to talk about what would be the implications of a kind of massive scale up on the one hand, and on the other hand, what are the implications? And Geoff knows one of my interests is what are the implications for the existing petrostates if we actually do bend the curve on carbon emissions? Now, as Geoff alluded in the opening part of the talk, it's in a way for all of us who don't live in Washington, it's strange to come to Washington and talk about bending the curve on carbon emissions since that has yet to be done. but it does seem to me if we want to imagine that the green economy or the economies based on sustainable energy that we think will come next, if we want them to look less like petrostates and less like boom and bust economies and less like sort of institutionalized corruption than the energy, than the political economy of energy that we have today, we really do have to think through what are the implications of boom and bust cycles in a whole set of new substances. And I guess the added piece of that is that my outsider perspective on the kind of Washington part of that debate is that while there has been a growing concern about access to rare earths in Washington, that the sort of reality of resource curse dynamics is sort of tagged on rhetorically into some of those discussions and some of those reports, but there isn't really any much attention being paid to it. And so I would like to kind of try to engender a little bit more thinking in the medium and long term about that.
Mm-hmm. So you could say one, you've kind of suggested that we haven't thought a lot about what the implications would be. One person who has written about it from a prominent post would be someone like Tom Friedman at the New York Times, who suggests one of the strong motivations for getting off a heavy dependence on overseas fossil fuels is to remove that subsidy that allows them to be non-democratic, to hold some of the what he sees as positions not favorable, at least in the United States, to have that kind of U.S. perspective. And that democracy is a natural flow from reducing that price of fuel getting off it. Is that part of the, how do you see that hypothesis as in terms of, does that qualify as critical thinking on what this future might look like?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that, well, a couple of things. No, I don't share his optimism that you said that sort of pulling the rug out from under petrostate economies will produce movements for democracy. It seems to me, if it does occur that way, it will be a historic surprise. But I would also sort of come back at it and say that we really don't have to think about a completely new energy system causing a lot of instability in current petro-dependent economies. That actually, if the rate of increase of the global economy of oil begins to slow, and even if we flatten that out, we start to go to, whether it's Russia or a number of Middle Eastern or a number of Central American economies, maybe even our brothers and sisters north of the border, for whom big parts of government spending and social stability are based on a lot of oil revenue, of oil and natural gas revenue. And if you begin to, and the expectation that revenue grows over time every single year into the future. So if you begin to turn that around and ask what happens if that revenue does not begin to grow, or does not continue to grow, that is, begins to either flatten out or decline, it seems to me that you don't have to imagine using 20 or 30% less fossil fuels in some distant location. You can sort of watch the way that the markets respond rather dramatically to those kind of stimuli.
Mm-hmm. Stacy mentioned this question of rare earth elements and strategic minerals, which, again, kind of by any calculation of a green economy and moving into some of these technologies that we see as necessary to make some of these transitions are part of the discussion. Maybe Cleo, could you talk about these inputs and is that should we be concerned about trading one dependency for another, and how does this fit into this equation of potential boon for new financial resources to new countries that don't have the petroleum or the others, or is it a threat in the resource curse context that we've heard about?
I mean, a lot depends on how you think geopolitics works. We know China, for example, has been very active in securing these supplies for a very long time, and see it in the context of general strategic security. We've been viewing it more from a commercial context, and this is obviously my opinion. And if you're looking at it from a commercial context or from one that says the market will provide, then you're dealing with a scarce resource with limited access, and the other people looking at that resource are dealing with it from a strategic perspective, which means they have a much wider way of much wider range of options for interacting with the people who have that supply, then you're dealing with a very uneven playing field, so to speak. So, and you can see it very clearly with existing energy sources, like the way China interacts with Sudan, where it's a complete country-to-country package deal. So they're not just, in exchange for the oil, they're doing military training and infrastructure and arms supply and diplomatic cover. And that's a very different sort of relationship than traditionally what the West has gone in with. Where, I mean, the thing about the resource curse is we've created a lot of those curses because it is convenient for us in order to secure steady supply to have a government we know is going to be in power for a long time. So, dictatorships have been extremely helpful for us in terms of how to secure that supply. And other countries see that sort of long-term governmental stability as beneficial as well. So, Canada has sort of escaped the curse because we'll always do what we're told anyway. But although it'll be interesting to see what happens when water starts to come into play. But in terms of sort of framing how access to these rare earth minerals will be, and we've actually talked about this before. One is our opinion of those minerals. Are they commercial or are they strategic? And the other is how everybody else is seeing it. And if other people are seeing it as strategic, that's a whole different ballgame. Mm-hmm. If I may, I'd just like to go back to something that Alexander was talking about at the beginning about the climate change and security debate in Europe, which I was sort of peripherally involved in. The framing of the debate was somewhat problematic. It was strictly constrained just to climate change, not to general environmental change issues. So it wasn't looking at depletion of water or change in land use or population or consumption, and that was very deliberate because it was designed to a large degree to motivate a discussion around mitigation. So the lines were kept very narrow, very thin, from climate change as a security risk to you have to cut carbon and ideally sign on to Copenhagen. And that's why we saw a big flurry of activity of publications of these reports leading up to Copenhagen about the climate change security risk, and particularly in the developing world. Now, there were two problems with that. One was it was a very narrow assessment of the risk. So if you look at what happened with Katrina, it was a Category 3 hurricane in a hurricane zone, but what we had done to that coastline in terms of draining wetlands, building on floodplains, the undermining of that infrastructure, you can cut all carbon emissions, stop all climate change. If you're still doing that, you're still going to have a very bad impact. So it wasn't an accurate perception of the security impacts. The other thing was it was focused on the developing world because the goal was to get the developing world to sign on. So it left out our vulnerabilities to larger environmental change issues, which I think are quite severe.
Okay, I think we'll come back to that. Whose vulnerabilities and where is the focus on it? I do think it's not just the Europeans who had a frame that was focused on an outcome around voting for either domestic legislation or getting a deal in Copenhagen, because clearly one strong element of the climate security links in this country has been finding arguments that work across the parties to get to an agreement, and understanding that the security community may have greater standing across a wider spectrum of people. And so that kind of climate security as tactic for communication versus climate security to assess threat is a difference that certainly is present here in the United States as well. Alexander, you had a point to come in on this?
I mean, prior to Copenhagen really pulling in a lot of supporters for arguing for or increasing the likelihood of any kind of concrete outcome in Copenhagen was obviously one of the motivations why many institutions, not only in Europe, pushed for assessments and dialogue about security and climate change. I'm a little bit less skeptical whether this was too narrow, because it built already on a series of deliberations, dialogues, conferences, and some sort of commitment also by governments in order to address that issue. And I think some of them, or many of them, have fully understood that. What they have probably underestimated, and I think this is interesting politically and also intellectually, is that this black and white position doesn't exist, both in terms of market aspect, access versus strategic dimension, and it doesn't exist whether conventional sources of energy compared to renewables. And I remember that in 2005, we were asked by the German Ministry for the Environment to come up with a study on the peace dividend of renewables. And there was a certain normative assumption or expectation. And to be honest, they were not too happy with this report because instead of just providing arguments for that, I mean, we provided a lot of arguments for that, we looked at reverse effects. We addressed the question of biofuels. We addressed the question of many other mitigation adaptation aspects that came up and popped up later, and we are discussing right now. And I guess that is something that we have to just dig deeper into that. And my key argument is not really to take a position on saying this is good or bad, but basically to carefully assess that. And assessment is often missing. Assessment is missing when it comes to rare earths. There's a tremendous potential there's a tremendous demand for innovation and renewable technologies of rare metals and rare earths. Some studies, at least the ones that I know in Germany, say they can be substituted, but it's a matter of scale. It's a matter of scale and whether you really look at domestic markets or if you assume that the entire world economy is making that shift that we actually want. So I haven't seen studies that basically do backcasting from targets like reduction of CO2 emissions of 50, 80, 95%, and what that would mean then in terms of demand. And I guess creating these democratic, sustainable governance structures for these commodities, I think, will take a very, very long time to build. And I guess this is the challenge that I see.
Cleo, you alluded to the as one shortcoming of this narrow framing, the fact that there's some big vulnerabilities that were missed, not part of that discussion. It has been often framed as issues in developing country contexts, but certainly if one reads even for a few minutes on your book, you're making a case that we have to have that larger lens around vulnerability and understanding threats.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Which is actually why it's a pleasure to see so many different sorts of people sitting around the table because, this isn't one problem. This is a million different problems, and it's going to require a million different solutions from a million different sectors. And people who understand their sectors and understand what the problems are going to be in their sectors and then how to find the solutions that are appropriate for the sectors. If you look just at the United States, I mean, there are over 50% of the population living along the coast. The coast is very dynamic. It's flooding. You're getting increasing storm surges, coastal erosion. But at the same time, you're getting these very active, much more direct impacts like depletion of groundwater. I mean, Vegas is crazy. You put a city in a desert that has a Venice in it, I mean, where's climate change aside? Where's the water going to come from, and how is that going to affect agriculture in California, and how's that going to affect the ability to cool thermal power plants? I mean, there was a nuclear power plant proposed for Utah, which has been shelved because they can't secure water rights for cooling. So you're starting to see that. I was in Louisville, Kentucky recently. In 1 year, they had I guess it was a tornado, a flood, and an ice storm. I mean, as a city manager, how do you budget for that? And because of the financial crisis, resilience is really low. So, the conventional wisdom is actually disaster is good for the economy because you get to rebuild afterwards. But, if you look at Katrina, that really didn't happen. At the time, Snow said there would be a 0.5% bump in the GDP as a result of rebuilding along the coast. It never happened. So, and in fact, you had a lot of people walk away from subprime mortgages, from destroyed properties that they couldn't insure anymore. So as you keep seeing these hits to already fragile systems, recovery is going to become increasingly difficult. And for me, it's something that's a very great concern.
Mm-hmm. And you want to say a word about the energy sector in particular? I think that's one where these issues are often grouped together, but not necessarily from the impacts of vulnerability on that.
Yeah. Global energy infrastructure is highly interconnected and extremely vulnerable. So we saw, hurricanes Katrina and Rita knocked down 113 platforms in the Gulf. Luckily, they had shut them off before they were evacuated. So we didn't see the sort of problems that we're seeing now. They destroyed over 450 pipelines, those sorts of things. And it was supposed to be a one-off event, but then Ike and Gustav went through in, I think, 2008. And again, everything was shut down preemptively because even if they don't get the damage, because insurance industry has kicked in, they need to evacuate the rigs. So you're getting disruption to supply in increasingly unstable offshore environments. Hydro generation, when you build a hydro plant, you look at the last 50 to 100 years of of river levels, precipitation patterns, then you design your hydro facility according to it. The last 50, 100 years in some areas tells us nothing about the next 5 to 10 years. And you see it in places like India, where a lot of the installations are heavily monsoon dependent, and the monsoon is kind of veering all over the map. So 2008, they had over 8% decline in hydro. 2009, over 12% decline in hydro. Now, if they can't get domestic hydro, which is a main energy source, they're going into the international marketplace, looking for other sources, putting stresses on an already difficult system. And in the case of nuclear or other thermal plants like coal, requires an enormous amount of water for cooling. And you're starting to see real disruption to ability to produce supply in places like France because the rivers, the water in the rivers is running in hotter, and there's a limit at the temperature with which you can discharge the water. So in 2003 in France, 17 nuclear reactors had to be powered down or shut off. It cost 300 million euros to France Electric. It was supposed to be a one-off. Happened again in 2006, and it happened again in 2009. So a lot of our energy infrastructure, basically we've designed our infrastructure making an assumption that the environment we've built it into is stable, and it's just not. So those new variabilities and new extremes are creating disruptions across the board.
You mentioned hydro, and then maybe Stacy could ask you to talk about hydro in part as an adaptation strategy, as an alternative or renewable, and debated, but nevertheless certainly something. And also maybe talk about some of the cooperation potential. We've been talking a lot about the negative. Do you see that as something that has some prospects?
Yeah, I mean, I think the issues of hydro in some regions of the world, and in fact the energy grid and its resilience sort of overlap. Energy grids are intensely national, even in places like the European Union, where they've been getting gradually less so, but actually pretty gradually. And so when we look at the potential for both states, interstate cooperation and sort of greater societal cooperation, I think you do look to the energy grid as one of those opportunities. So if we think about one of the debates, and I think Cleo is exactly right, that the challenge here is what we build into the assumptions about the changing climate. One of the debates I've been sort of party to a little bit is looking at the ways in which there are opportunities in South Asia for hydropower to help supply hydropower in places like Nepal and Bhutan to help supply parts of China and parts of India with more renewable energy. But that actually requires a grid that moves relatively seamlessly across a whole set of borders that are actually fairly closed. I mean, they're politically closed. On the ground, they're completely porous. People pour back and forth over them all the time. But at the official level, there's very little cooperation about them. So you wouldn't plan to build an energy grid over it just because several 100,000 people move back and forth per month. So the energy grid, I think, is one opportunity. Another opportunity I see for sort of cooperative potential is that when we connect climate change and security issues to some of the things we've been talking about for several years, like migration potential. Here, I think some of the evidence suggests that while there's been a kind of alarmist view in Europe and North America about the likelihood of people from the developing world pouring over the borders because of climate change, I think there's a fair bit of alarmism there. On the other hand, we are fairly confident that there's going to be a lot of internal migration because of environmental change in the global south, and a lot of cross-border migrations, global south country to global south country. And here, we don't really have, and the American foreign policy has not been particularly helpful in terms of helping to build sort of robust regional cooperation in the south. So if we look at places like South Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa and its subregions, there are a huge number of countries in these regions whose relationships to Europe and North America are better and closer than they are to their neighbors. And so here again, that's a situation in which you reduced resilience or you reduce flexibility to adapt to environmental change and its second and third order implications when people start to move, or when the energy grid becomes challenged, or when you have climate variability and you need energy from a different kind of source next door. They may actually have it next door, but you can't transport it across the border. So I think there's a lot of potential for better regional cooperation and a role to play for sort of global international organizations and U.S. foreign policy to begin to sort of think more critically about how to build those regional, help to build those regional cooperation organizations.
So, Cleo or Alexander, in this context, whether it's transboundary or regional, as Stacy's been talking about, or even national, do you see prospects for essentially what could be framed as a triple bottom line, or the multiple wins that some of the, particularly in the adaptation area, we could be making adaptation investments that would build capacities to address the impacts of climate change, could advance development, and then also have peace-building benefits? Is that the kind of thing that folks too clever by half come up with and try to sell, but there's really nothing to it?
These things are often a subset of general geopolitics. So we've talked about the Himalayan situation. Essentially, India and China are fighting or have proxy conflict situation in the Himalayan region using influence in other countries. So a lot of the potential for cooperation depends on what will happen with the India-China relationship. And a lot about what will happen with the India-China relationship depends on what will happen with the U.S.-India relationship. So if the U.S.-India relationship gets stronger, personally, I think you're likely to see a continuation of conflict and tension in the Himalayan region between client states. If the U.S.-India relationship degrades, then you're likely to see India moving more towards China, in which case you may see a little bit more cooperation. Now, there are similarly other areas where you can see geopolitics playing out through adaptive measures. The Kingdom of Tonga, for example, has declared it's going to, in the South Pacific, is declared it's going to go 50% renewable by 2012, probably the most ambitious targets on the planet. But they have a total population of about 100,000. So basically that means renewables for 50,000 people. They've been very actively engaged by Abu Dhabi on this, because Abu Dhabi wants to position itself as a leader, as a renewable energies leader. And they realized when they were deciding where to place IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, something like that, that it took the 8 votes of those Pacific islands in the UN in order to get the headquarters based in Abu Dhabi. Otherwise, it would have gone to Europe. And in fact, you ended up with satellite agencies in Germany and Austria anyway. So and next week, there's going to be the first meeting between the Arab League and the Pacific Island leaders. So you see, because of that new geopolitical relationship between this potentially quite useful voting bloc in the Pacific and the Arab League positioning itself as a renewables leader, you see a transfer of technology. It's likely that Abu Dhabi will pony up a ton of money for renewables in Tonga, in part to create a more strategic long-term relationship over Pacific Island votes in international fora. So you may start to see cooperation. Generally, it's going to be, as usual, a subset of geopolitics.
An interesting twist on the adaptation strategy of petroleum-based states in terms of, yes, future carbon. Alexander?
You pointed out the potential for regional cooperation, but I wonder when we go through cooperation along rivers, cooperation on monitoring and verification on all sorts of adaptation and mitigation strategies, I wonder why the notion of regional cooperation is always brought in later on. So basically something seemed to be forgotten right from the beginning. I mean, one thing is that we have a series of national adaptation plans, which are national per se, and the setting up of regional centers to encourage regional cooperation on adaptation, because national adaptation programs might have severe impacts on both in riparian countries along rivers or just neighboring countries in terms of water demand for agriculture, severe impacts on their neighboring countries. So I guess we're overestimating a little bit how realistic it is that the potential is picked up, because the potential is not per se there. And I guess what is new is if you compare that to the entire debate on whether we have water wars or more cooperation, and there is evidence that we have more cooperation, I think the situation has changed, because it's not so much about identification of wins, but it's very much combined with an increasing amount of pressure that is coming up. Pressure that is now demonstrated through, as you indicated, or demonstrated for even industrialized countries, vulnerability of the economy. And I think the more vulnerable the economy gets, and the more dependent already marginalized communities in developing countries become, I think the more unlikely it is that they are ready for regional cooperation without really getting incentives either on an institutional basis, or as you, Cleo, described that with India and China, when superpowers, regional superpowers, find an agreement and really demonstrate that they would like to use their regional power and influence in order to promote then regional cooperative efforts. And I think this gets across forestry, water, sustainable mountain development, whatever you take, it is, I think, more a structural problem, and this is not solved yet.
No, I don't disagree with that, and I think one of the reasons that thinking about environmental change and security together in terms of opportunities and sustainable development, in terms of opportunities for regional cooperation, is that I would not be one who holds much hope for robust regional environmental organizations. I mean, the fact of the matter is, if you create sort of nice environmental this is someone, unfortunately, my life has been trafficked in studying international environmental cooperation. But they are by definition weak institutions. So unless you're talking about regional cooperation that takes on people's energy needs and energy security, their sustainable development, economic development opportunities, and have in those a discussion of climate change and its implications, then I think you do simply run yet again failed experiments in how important it would be to have another regional organization with environment in the title. I wouldn't be upset if such organizations didn't have environment in the title at all. In part because by definition people assume that it's a weak organization if it's got environmental in the title. That this is the sort of geopolitical positioning again, right?
Another category of interventions on the mitigation side that we've heard about, and some of the more creative ways to share some of the benefits with some of the most affected communities, is this RED, reduced emissions from deforestation, forest degradation. Alexander, I think you and your colleagues have done some research looking at both the conflict and the peace side of this equation, and that kind of intervention of providing resources to communities to keep those forests standing as carbon sinks, and put some value on them standing as well as cut. Do you want to share the insights from your research?
Very initial research. This is the reason why it's not published. But yeah, I mean, basically, it is a screening of reports out on RED. I mean, it's a larger discussion on where are the conflict lines, and I guess there are a couple of conflict lines. One has to do with marginalization of local communities. Another has to do with the entire governance system. We have great hopes in order to establish a regulatory mechanisms for RED without actually having a monitoring and verification system in place. We compare this often to the question of forest-related conflicts. I mean, the dynamics there are slightly different. Because it's not a commodity that can be traded there, and is a high-value commodity. But it's a high-value commodity when we have these schemes that I was talking about established. But I guess a lot of questions still remain. For instance, the question of tenureship, ownership, access to resources. So who owns it? Who owns the carbon rights And I guess it's an interesting governance question because the structure and who owns forests in countries differ. In some countries you have a privatized forest market, and others you have state forests. It is a risk that we see is of RED replacing other bribe generating activities, and I think especially in countries like the DRC or Cambodia, where basically revenues from illegal logging and forest products were basically used in order to finance rebel groups, might look and occupy a market or design a market for their own benefit. It affects the same discussion as the biofuel discussion affects the question of replacing food crops for the sake of exploring carbon sinks. So I think there are a lot of untouched and unexplored conflict potentials associated with RED. And at the same time, I mentioned already monitoring and verification. There is a greater potential also to address this from a perspective of building the governance structure through sustainable forest management, through verification schemes, through certification schemes, etc., especially to help building the necessary governance structures at the local level. Because I guess that's the key entry point for that, because we're talking a lot about a global mechanism, which might be then a market mechanism under the CDM, but basically we talk about sustainable livelihood security at the local level. So I guess that is, as I said, an unexplored potential, but very important in the aftermath of Copenhagen. I guess one of the key features discussed at the moment, as we see it in the negotiations for the preparation of Cancun.
I would only add that I think we learned over the years of of the 1980s and early 1990s when the sort of call to protect the rainforests was so prominent in the West. I think we saw that that engendered a lot of violence and a lot of rights reduction in huge parts of the rainforested world. Right? I think we know this empirically now. That because what it meant was that it was one of a justification then for states across parts of South America and across parts of Asia to assert state control over people and land and territory for which the state did not actually have control, right? And so if I think about, I think one of the organizations that does some of the best work currently on forestry politics is a London-based group called Global Witness, right? And they have some fantastic documentation about the extreme violence in localized, sort of forestry politics in many parts of the world. And if I think about the sort of the localized violence and sort of oppression that they have documented well, connected to the current forestry market, and the current forestry market is, of course, about cutting down trees and exporting them, right? And if I add to that kind of global regime, which under RED, that assumes state capacity and it assumes that states can run things, and it assumes, then I think you've got some really interesting and rather alarming countervailing incentives. So on the one hand, somebody's going to get paid to leave the trees, and on the other hand, somebody else is going to have real incentives to cut them down and trade them illegally. And that strikes me as the recipe for some really brutal stuff. If we acknowledge how forestry politics works now in many parts of the world, we have to guess that there's going to be a rough go should there be a new system.
Okay. Encouraging. Well, let's take that pessimism one step further. Let's presume, as some have intimated, that we're having real challenges taking the steps that many feel are necessary in terms of mitigation. And many of us have talked about the concern of how appealing shortcuts might be, shortcuts that are often lumped under the term geoengineering. So kind of big technology to try to find ways to either store carbon or reflect sunlight and lower the greenhouse effect. So is geoengineering, should that be part of this discussion in terms of conflict or cooperation potential, in terms of the basket of responses that may become even more politically salient and part of the discussion and how we respond to these challenges?
Yeah, I guess 2 points I would make on my own thinking about this. One is that it seems to me one possible path for sort of the grand geoengineering schemes is that they as Geoff has heard me say before, they take what I think of as the missile defense path or the American sort of nuclear policy path, which is to say that we pour billions and billions of dollars in them year after year, and they produce not a lot in the end of the day, besides some amount of increased number of lobbyists and and people who are employed on the American tax dollar. So I think that that's one possibility for it. When I think about sort of larger what-if schemes, sort of trying to confiscate or control the commons by essentially saying that one group or a group of countries wants to geoengineer the globe, certainly has in it the potential for a lot of political conflict, no doubt. But I would add that under the scenario you lay out, one of the challenges there will be that if the United States, and I think added to this list going into the near future, if the United States and China cannot demonstrate that they are willing to curb their emissions in the globe, they both, it seems to me, share a very real threat of being blamed by the rest of the world for already taking the commons. So in other words, the argument is the same if you don't curb your carbon emissions. The United States and China are geoengineering the globe now, right? We are warming the globe more and more rapidly. And so therefore, you either say, well, we're going to continue to warm the globe, and we're going to take the political hits and hope that nothing we really care about is linked to that in multilateral affairs, and then wait till later so then we can re-geoengineer the globe back the other way. I mean, I think that's sort of one of the conceptual paths, but I think we have to acknowledge in the geoengineering debate that that's what we're doing now as Americans and increasingly with our brothers and sisters in China, right? We are changing the global atmosphere and its climate. And many, many of the costs, maybe probably most of the costs for those climate changes are going to be borne by people who do not either A, live in the United States, or B, live in China. And at some point they may get wind that it wasn't them that done it. So I think that that sort of geopolitical context for me is really important. And I think we already we saw examples of it in the second half of the Bush administration where constructing the United States as a country that uses its power without care or warrant for what that does to other people was becoming common. You saw it in domestic elections in friendly and unfriendly countries alike. You see it in the political rhetoric. Even our friend Osama bin Laden discovered this. Some of you may have seen one of these. This was just a few months ago, 3 or 4 months ago, his sort of missive about the Americans changing the climate. So even at that level, there's sort of it's becoming. Somebody thinks it's rhetorically useful to at least point it out, and those strike me as sort of canaries in the geopolitical coal mine. That's a really terrible mixed metaphor.
Cleo, your take on this question?
Geoengineering depends on whether you're looking at it politically, economically, or scientifically. And to look at it scientifically for a second, because that really...
God forbid we bring science into this.
That's right. Might be a good starting point. And we have a lot of meteorologists in the room, so I'm going to be very nervous about this. But hopefully, if you have any thoughts afterwards, it'd be great to hear them. Even if it did everything it said it did, even if it took out exactly the same amount of carbon that we have put in over the last 100-odd years and continues to take out exactly the amount that we're putting in, and even if carbon was the only problem and methane wasn't an issue and all sorts of other greenhouse gases weren't an issue, it wouldn't solve our water supply problem, our building and floodplains problem, our, all of the other environmental problems that are incredibly destabilizing all over the world. So it's being presented sort of as a big one-off fix that we don't have the guts to embrace. But as a starting point, it's not a big one-off fix. in the best of circumstances, even taking it within the parameters with which it is presented. Politically, it's very appealing to people in Europe. I could say this because I'm based in the UK, because it gives you another global regime to try to set up, which they love doing and they're very experienced at doing. But the assumption has been that global regimes are largely Western created, controlled, and dominated. I don't think that's the case anymore. So if you look at what's happening to the WTO negotiations or the Copenhagen negotiations, I think you try to set up a global regime around this, and you might find some surprises, because it will be a subset of general geopolitical relationships between the major powers anyway. So like Copenhagen, it may not be that much about climate and be a lot about other political issues. Economically, it's also really appealing because it's a big amount of money to set up new, Manhattan Project type organizations. So again, people may try to set up big research projects. Will they implement? I agree with Stacy. They probably won't directly implement because the blowback potential is pretty high. If you mess up, it'll come back to haunt you. Now, what they may do is use cutouts and front companies to do testing that can't be traced back to them. So, I mean, geoengineering is a big topic, but the way that you look at it is the way that you would look at many other of these sorts of topics that would fall under the current political and economic rubrics. Mm-hmm. The other thing, just by the by, is what's kind of more likely to be utilized and potentially create at least regional conflict is weather modification. So if, for example, China uses it quite extensively. I know it's not dumb enough to use like if China has no water and rain clouds are heading towards Kazakhstan and both countries need water, theoretically China could seed the clouds and grab the water before it goes to Kazakhstan. Now, I don't think they're going to do that because they're pretty smart about relationships with neighbors. But they might, if they're operating in Sudan, help the Sudanese do it to get the rain before the clouds pass over into one of their neighboring countries. So there won't be the blowback directly to China. So again, it becomes assumed to general geopolitical relationships. But I would be more concerned in terms of actually being able to implement something and having a blowback as a result from weather modification as opposed to geoengineering.
I remember, Geoff, that before Copenhagen you dropped a couple of emails saying, well, geoengineering, the debate is coming, and I was waiting for the debate. It's true, it's coming, but slowly. It's slowly, I guess, because I think we have to make a distinction. When we talk about geoengineering, we talk about CCS technologies, so carbon sequestration, and to store it underground. Something that has a different effect because it's a localized effect. We can do it in industrialized countries, and the effects most likely remain in our countries, or whether we apply technologies in order to modify the oceans to better absorb CO2 or to reflect the sunlight, which might have quite easily effects on weather patterns and precipitation levels in neighboring countries, so immediate effects on agriculture and economy in neighboring countries. I think that is a distinction. What is interesting and what I would assume, because it was a little bit black and white, the Americans promoting and larger companies promoting such kind of large-scale technologies, and the European are a little bit skeptic about that. I think that's not true. I remember that last year the German government, I think it was last year, introduced a pilot program on CCS technology, and they thought they can push it through as a cabinet decision, and briefly discussing, not briefly, but discussing it in Parliament. And when they took the decision, there were a lot of protests by that very community to say, well, we're not informed at all. And they realized, and I was a bit surprised that they were so naive, to expect from a population to buy that immediately and to say, okay, carbon sequestration. I mean, we store all that stuff under your living room, so what happens there? So, what are the impacts? What are the impacts long term? Can we trust those who make the decision? That's one thing. The other thing is that it's very much associated with industry. I guess that makes it so compelling that it's a big market that we can expect. But can we expect from those companies to develop new technologies, but which are basically the same companies that developed old technologies that are part of the problem that we want to fix right now. And I guess what happens in the Gulf of Mexico is a good indication that the question of equity, do we produce a large-scale and assumable cheap technology option, because that's the argument, it's much cheaper, which is accessible maybe for industrialized countries, but not for the most of the developing world, that we basically sideline the basic principle of European environmental policy, which is the precautionary principle, and the question of responsibility. So I guess there are many, many concerns that need to be carefully addressed. And one thing that the entire debate on technology options or techno fixes is not being aware is that we are discussing an approach that leaves out completely, I think, one of the core questions of moving towards a sustainable society and changing consumption and production patterns. And I guess that's something where policymakers in the EU, both at the Commission level and also in the member states, are very sensitive because we're looking back. We're not where we want to be, but there are some achievements around the globe on sustainable development and changing consumption patterns. I think they realize that if we would shift towards such a technology fix, we would give up the necessary pressure that we would need in order to further develop production and consumption patterns.
Yeah, a final question before we go to broader discussion, which is there a danger in kind of doing what we're doing, which is pointing out all the difficulties of trying to seriously take on climate change, and both the mitigation and the adaptation? What's the what's the metaphor? Is it a tightrope, or is it hopefully not walking the plank? What is it we're doing that, how do we have this conversation in terms of going into these alternatives with our eyes open versus providing unwittingly or unintentionally more ammunition for inaction?
Yeah, well, I mean, on the one hand, I'm not nearly powerful enough to influence such a debate, I think. My sense is that it's a very productive set of conversations to have if we link them to kind of broader discussions of what kind of sort of more sustainable societies we want to build and move toward, right? And that includes a more sustainable national societies as well as global ones. So do we want to do we want to replace the current energy system with one that produces the same kind of really brutal and environmentally degrading outcomes in huge parts of the world, only with different sets of commodities? Or do we want to move toward one that has essentially better regulated markets, and more sort of more controls on the trade-offs? I think it's without discussing and raising some of these terms, we can see a path very clearly towards simply recreating what passes for recreating the ramifications of oil markets and forestry markets now, and they're pretty unpleasant for a whole lot of people in them, and so I think we have to sort of embrace it. The other thing, of course, is that opponents of climate policy action can be counted on to use whatever rhetorical strategy with whatever audience on whatever day they think is useful. So I can't really feel too responsible for whatever one of that they pick up, because they have more resources to find them than I do. So.
Oh, I think we should be talking about this all the time. I mean, we need to blow open the box on how complicated these problems are and how interrelated they are, and how it's not just, I mean, one of the reasons I like the center is because you have, environment and not just climate change in the title. And so it lets you address a much wider range of problems. And we have to not just look at environmental shifts, challenges, transitions, but also economic and geopolitical if we're going to come up with something cohesive going into the future. And we need as many different people involved and as many different sorts of solutions as possible. I mean, this BP thing has been really interesting, because suddenly it's like everybody's an inventor. right? You've got sort of websites popping up. James Cameron's going to, solve the BP problem, apparently. I mean, it would be great if we can present the situation in such a way so that everybody in the, is working on these problems also, because they're going to be just as affected. I mean, especially if you're living along the Gulf Coast. So, I mean, the more we discuss them and the more we try to reframe the problems, understand the problems, see how it's going to affect us locally, see how it's going to affect us politically, the more people can come into the debate and find solutions that other sectors may not even have thought of. So, for me, this is great.
I read on my way here the quite interesting, in the beginning boring and then interesting study, very interesting study by the Swedish Society for Nature Conservation, and they commissioned that report on the potential of geoengineering. Boring because I knew some of the arguments in the beginning, but interesting in the end because they provided one argument. They're not saying that this is terribly awful, but they made the recommendation, which is simply saying we need more comprehensive assessment. So I'm wondering a little bit when we talk about mitigation and adaptation that we are arguing for something that is very usual for any kind of investment, because you would like to check your investment beforehand, its implications in market terms, as you say, in strategic terms, as we discussed it here. And I guess this is what I'm missing, but I'm a little bit surprised that we're asking for something that we could assume and do assume on whatever technology we apply, because we don't develop a technology and put it on the market without knowing what kind of side effects that might have. I mean, there are good examples. You quoted the entire nuclear problem there, but I guess we have learned from these large-scale failed investments and negative effects future generations will deal with. And so I guess I consider that as an opportunity. I consider it as an opportunity for a more open-minded discussion. And I would say that when it comes to geoengineering, I wouldn't mind really think this through, but I would be very much concerned to give some kind of wild card to real-world applications of technologies. We just don't know what the modification of weather patterns mean. I mean, we have very little restricted examples. We know from the Chinese Olympic Games that they have modified the weather to get better pictures broadcasted all over the world. I wouldn't mind, but there are some concerns, and I guess we should deal with them quite seriously.
Okay, terrific. Well, you've heard a lot from us. We want to hear from all you and have an active discussion. Because we are webcasting it, we ask that you wait till one of my colleagues brings you a microphone and use the microphone to let us know who you are and pose your question. Do please make it a short, concise question. We obviously have lots of folks and want to hear from lots of people. What we may do is capture a few questions and then let the panelists divide and conquer in terms of responding to them so we can best position them. Who would like to kick us off in terms of the discussion? We have one down here, Russell. And gentleman, Tara, there's one right here in the middle, so we can anticipate him as a second. Or we'll just pass that across to you.
Hello, thank you for the interesting panel. My name is Mishkat Al-Mumin. I'm the founder of Women in the Environment Organization in Iraq. My question is this: is there a connection between environmental policies, ill and designed environmental policies, and insurgency group in your research? Have you come across such a case? My interest in this question is as follows. The ill-designed timber policy in Afghanistan resulted in killing many American soldiers. How should we address this issue? Should we address it as an environmental issue, an environmental policy or management, or should we address it as a security issue? Thank you.
Okay, and ma'am, if you could pass the gentleman right there, we'll collect a couple questions.
My name is Alan Hoffman. I'm with the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy at the U.S. Department of Energy. And I wanted to say that first because I have a question about nuclear. I mean, I'd love to see the world go renewables tomorrow, but I know that's not going to happen. But I heard the word nuclear once. At the very end of the discussion, Alex mentioned it in passing. What are your views on the role of nuclear power in addressing global climate change?
No, thank you. It's one that we certainly debated earlier today, so we can hopefully have some interesting responses. Down here, Andrew's got a question. If we could bring him.
Thanks, Geoff. Andrew Holland with the International Institute for Strategic Studies. I wanted to follow up on Stacy's point on Osama bin Laden's talking about climate change and kind of the general grievance issue. We also heard the Sudanese minister calling the failure of Copenhagen, comparing it to the Holocaust. Is this a real grievance? First of all, do you think? And what's the consequences of that? What is the direct action? I mean, does this mean that Sudanese are going to start terrorist attacks against coal power plants throughout Africa? That sort of stuff. Where do we go with that? So.
Okay. So we have three. Should we take those and then we can collect some more?
I'll take the last one first, and just. I think when the kind of when the articulators of the climate change grievance are Sudanese leaders and Osama bin Laden, that helps to make them easy to dismiss, right? But I think what we risk is the ever increasing notion that climate change, the lack of responsibility for having changed the climate, is symbolic of who we are as Americans or of our role in the world, right? I mean, so the extent to which if it becomes ever more constructed as one of the things that helps you understand the role the United States plays in the world, i.e. one in which pursues its own interests and its own wealth at the expense of virtually every kind of value it espouses, right? Then you begin to risk more than just sort of the odd grievance. You begin to risk increasing the incentives for a lot more important actors than the Sudanese president to link climate change and the lack of action or the lack of leadership to things the United States foreign policy cares more about, right? So I mean, I think that you set up a recipe for issue linkage here if the grievances continue. And one of the things that interests me in a way, sort of going forward, is that I think that same calculation increasingly applies to China, so that you see a shared fear. And in fact, my impression is that the Chinese leaders know and worry more about being blamed for changing the climate now than do the United States leaders, right? So I mean, so this is also in a way a worrying prospect. For me, I'll say only about the forest. All of the cases I know about ill-designed environmental policies and environmental intentions, the ones with which I'm most familiar are all forest-related. There are quite a number, and I think we could come up with them on 3 or 4 continents.
These are great questions. So thank you all. It's a really interesting issue. The problem with leaving it in the realm of environment, as was alluded to before, is environment within a government structure tends to be the one that's listened to last, if at all. So if I mean, this is a place where there is a very clear case to make for making an environmental change a security issue. If only to bring in levers that you couldn't bring in otherwise. And not just a security issue, it's an economic issue, it's a political issue. If you get disruption on the ground, it will exacerbate existing factionalism within the society. I think you see it in Afghanistan. It'll be interesting to see what happens with the destruction of the poppy crop as a result of the spread of crop disease, what that'll actually do to the political situation there. So many cases where you're dealing with societies that are barely subsistence, because a lot of the surrounding infrastructure has been destroyed. Any little environmental stress around food supply, water supply, or economic-based agriculture, things like that, can create rippling, cascading, very destructive effects. So they need to be taken very seriously, and often they're not. I've had lots of discussions with Afghanistan experts who can't tell me what the water supply is in Afghanistan. You know, it's not a luxury to overlook those things. So I commend you for bringing it up, and I hope that it does get taken up quite a bit more. In the context of Andrew's question, these issues, when they're brought up in this context, have a lot of resonance for people on the ground. So, I mean, we may or may not dismiss what he's saying, but his audience is taking it very seriously, and it has a lot of ancillary effects. So if you have a water supply problem and you can blame it on someone else, you don't have to do anything about that water supply problem. Right? So you can see it, for example, a little bit. Now, I'm tracking this, so this is preliminary. I wouldn't put it in print, but apparently I'll put it on the web.
We're all quality researchers.
That's right. You know, the India-Pakistan relationship over water, you started to see the Pakistan rhetoric around water supply coming from India really ramp up when the discussion around the Mumbai bombers happened. So you had a meeting that Pakistan and India was supposed to go into that was supposed to be about the Mumbai bombing. And suddenly Pakistan's talking about water supply and how India is trying to constrict its water supply. Now, that creates a situation, it gives political cover, but it also creates a situation within Pakistan where Pakistan is almost incentivized not to deal with domestic water management issues, because it helps stoke the anti-India fires on the ground, and it gives another reason to motivate kind of, you know, anti-India elements within Pakistan. So we are not the intended audience for a lot of this messaging. The same is true in the Arctic, actually. Katie Antrim is very good on the Arctic, knows how the Russians are receiving a lot of these messaging also. I mean, that flag planted on the North Pole, that went over great in Russia. You know, and the Canadian posturing around the Arctic goes over great around election time in Canada. So in terms of these discussions, it's useful often to think of who is the intended audience and how will that affect decision-making in that area. In terms of nuclear, I'm not sure, were you here when I gave a sort of long little rant about nuclear and water? No, okay. We did address nuclear. In terms of nuclear, I have two concerns. One is in terms of site stability, because a nuclear build is a very long-term build. It's on a site for minimum 100 years, and it needs a lot of water. So it's either along the coast, which means it can be subject to sea level rise, storm surges, change in coastal geomorphology. They're having, you know, we've had problems in Florida with site stability for nuclear plants. Or it's along a river, which means that it's subject to changing river levels, temperature levels. These are largely engineering issues and design issues. Right now, environmental change isn't being incorporated into the design of the plants. If environmental change is incorporated into the design of the plants, they may end up more stable over the long term. But right now, they're not. So you're getting increasing powering down in France of nuclear plants during hot weather. So those sorts of things would need to be incorporated. So you have the question about site stability if you're along a coast, a vulnerable coastline, and you have the question of ability to generate if you're dependent on water. And uranium supply is a whole other question. If we're sticking to nuclear plants, are we going to hit peak uranium? Is the competition over uranium going to become like a rare earth competition or an oil gas competition where it can create little Middle Easts all over Africa where you have kind of unaligned supply of uranium? These are just all questions that I think would need to be seriously considered before we do a large-scale global ramping up of nuclear. Yeah. Yes. That's right. Yeah. Nuclear is funny because it lives in its sort of own little economic bubble. So if you look at India, for example, you know, India, for strategic reasons, will produce much more expensive power from a nuclear plant because it gives it strategic advantage for its weapon systems and for its ability to offer an umbrella to allies. So the economics around nuclear, I mean, you're right, sort of as I don't know, kind of a watt per watt basis, it may be kind of questionable, but that's not really what nuclear is to a lot of countries.
Alexander, you want to weigh in this or go to
Yeah, I thought that I end up with this question, but anyway, as usual. Just one question on environmental policy, whether that is a root cause for supporting insurgency groups. Stacy, I agree with the forest sector. I would extend then and say policies related to land issues, but I have a little bit of different take. Whether you can assign this really to ill-designed environmental policy, I have my doubts. I mean, I was involved in the late 90s in negotiation talks or pre-accession preparation programs for a couple of Eastern European countries joining the EU. And the European Union has taken an approach not really, I mean, basically they said, okay, a precondition is that you take over fully the acquis communautaire, the entire legal body on environment, energy, and all the other chapters. But basically the way of preparing these countries, and the same way we are dealing at the moment with European neighborhood policy initiative, or under this initiative with neighboring countries, is that we basically try to identify basic principles in environmental policy, which are related to monitoring, which are related to transparency issues, to access to justice, access to information, participation. So I think it's not very much or exclusively the design of environmental policy, but it's very much the design and its implementation of basic concerns and basic elements of a governance structure that you build up in a country. Whether then it depends a little bit how on what kind of insurgency groups you are talking about, but then, I mean, you can end up and look a little bit more deeper on the specifics of forests and land, or sometimes even associated with water in terms of use, competition, and also to use it as a target. The second one that you raised the question of what about nuclear energy? I think it's difficult really to talk in this context of mitigation, adaptation, or mitigation exclusively about the question of what about nuclear energy. It depends very much on the energy mix that you have. I mean, apart from the arguments that you made associated with climate change impacts, is still the question of storage capacity, which we don't have globally. Not yet, but we are still using the technology, and the question of proliferation. And putting all this together, I mean, it's a question whether you come to the conclusion that's just too risky. I would come to that conclusion. But I mean, we consider that officially in this government in Germany as a bridging technology, because we would use it. And I guess we have to think about alternatives, either gas-fired power plants for a certain period of time, apart from renewables, because renewables, first of all, cannot satisfy today energy demands, and we have a huge problem of supply at the right time, at the right place. So if you don't solve the grid problem, moving towards larger and smart grids, I think we will rely on a couple of bridging technology, whether that is coal or whether this is nuclear energy. We have the debate going on with this government in Germany of extending basically the concessions for nuclear power plants. I guess it's a difficult decision to take, and but we have to keep up the pressure in order to build up and further build capacities for expanding renewables. And if we give concessions for many more years, then we don't solve the problem. And I guess that is one of the risks in the debate at the moment, the political debate, that we would enter into some sort of vacuum where there's not enough pressure really to continue the way of promoting renewables.
More questions? This gentleman over here in the middle. Got a bunch of them over here. Maybe could you just pass the microphone across? Make it a little easier.
Geoff Locke, Population Action International. Thanks again, Geoff, for this panel. I guess this question is for all the panelists, but I'm particularly interested in Cleo's response. How does climate affect geopolitical relationships between two countries, Bangladesh and India? You've touched on Pakistan, but the situation in Bangladesh, you have 85% of the population living in floodplains. This population is growing. It's becoming denser. Their NAPA largely ignores migration. Their finance minister back in December in Copenhagen said by 2050 he expects up to 20 million environmental refugees. And then India has responded with a 2,500-mile, 12-foot-high barbed wire enforced fence. So I'm curious, to that question, how does climate fit into these geopolitical relationships there? And what types of resilience projects should Bangladesh be looking at to address this?
If you pass it down to this gentleman, then we'll pass it across the table.
Yeah, thank you first for a great discussion on a variety of issues. My name's Brad Christ. I'm a student at Georgetown University, and I'm working this summer for the Climate Institute. This goes to the whole panel. You mentioned the RED program and deforestation, but I was wondering what you think of the loss of the world's grasslands, which make up more than 70% of the Earth's surface. It doesn't seem to receive a whole lot of attention in the media and policy. And also related to that, how do you address the environmental and economic impact of this greater problem of desertification and biodiversity loss?
Okay. Pass it right across there.
Thank you. Heather Jeffen with Rotary Environmental. And in 1985, United Nations wrote a report about development and identified exploitation as a major underscore of a lot of problem: water, land resources, and renewable resources, and so on. Taking that, extrapolating on this report, how much you can see from what's going on right now, exploitation vis-a-vis the environment. I mean, is it still a valid concern, or? Thank you.
Okay. There's some other capture. Tara, halfway back on the left. Right here.
Hi, I'm Nick Parlato. I'm a student at Oberlin College, but I'm working here as an intern over the summer. And I was wondering, in the context that we're discussing of scarcity of resources, among other things, what the likelihood and implications of bioterrorism would be, particularly in the U.S., but I suppose across the entire globe.
Okay, boy, you guys are giving us some wide latitude here. Why don't we get one more? Tara, there's a question, right? Or Russell, whoever's. Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, I'm
oh,
sitting
Cynthia,
down very
sorry,
low.
can't see you.
That's
Go
okay.
ahead. Cynthia Brady.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks to all the panelists. My name is Cynthia Brady, and I'm with USAID's Conflict Office. So I'm going to ask you a question about conflict. Cleo, you mentioned adaptation and mitigation financing in particular. And my question is, as we think about how donor investments in adaptation and mitigation in particular are going to ramp up in the coming years, there has not been a lot of discussion about the conflict implications of those investments. And I'm curious from your perspectives where you think the greatest risks might be, particularly in a number of countries where these investments are going to be made. The governments don't have a great track record with the equitable allocation of resources or the equitable management of their natural resources. And we know that that perception of the management of those resources is often one of the key drivers of grievance and therefore of conflict. So how do you see this overlap between these huge donor investments and how that money will be managed and or mismanaged? And what are the key areas that you think could become the problems? And then conversely, I wonder if you have any recommendations for the policy side of how to avoid those challenges. Thank you.
Cleo, should we start with that, with you?
With that one?
Or wherever you like.
Okay.
But since it was couple addressed directly to you.
Cynthia, do you have anything particular in mind?
No, well, I can give you, sure. A couple of
Yeah.
examples actually came up a little bit here with respect to indigenous control over forest resources, for example.
Yeah.
RED policies that governments might be implementing, the perceived expropriation of local economic assets for those other purposes, those types of things.
Yeah.
But I'm open to things completely different than that.
Yeah, I agree. And essentially, it's if you have a system that has weaknesses and you're putting pressure on that system, and pressure can be defined as more money, you'll see fractures where there are fractures already existing in the system. So it's basic, but it's very difficult to give an overall example without looking at specific countries. In terms of finding, and we can talk about, this can tie into Bangladesh after if you want, but in terms of finding ways around that, there's certain sorts of engagement that are becoming increasingly problematic, especially between the West and the developing world. And this comes back to probably 20 minutes ago, we were using the word verification. There are countries, India, for example, will not sign on to anything now that will include the word verification. And this has become a dirty word as a result of the U.S.-India nuclear deal. So you're pushing a button that actually has nothing to do with this particular realm. But we saw it with Copenhagen. I mean, they go up the wall if you mention verification, because it's been within the national context. It's become code for concerns about protectionism, tariffs, industrial espionage, those sorts of things, rightly or wrongly. So part of engaging effectively is to understand, because they probably won't tell you, what the existing concerns are around that kind of engagement and how they're hearing what you're saying. China will come in to do development in Africa. They use a completely different language. Now, the results may not be that different, or maybe that different, whatever, but they're much better at using a language that is less likely to put up barriers. Because as soon as you put up barriers, it's very difficult to get accurate information about what the problems are. And then, as a result, it's very difficult to put in place programs that will actually be beneficial. And the money will, the developing world is also getting a lot better at figuring out what words we like to hear, and as a result, release money that way, and then it just gets diverted into other projects. So the initial phase is really basic, getting to know each other in a new way type of process. And again, we have, I'm sorry to go back to poor old little Tonga, but Tonga is a really interesting example, because they decided they were going to go 50% renewable. And they said, we don't want the old development model where countries come in and say what they're going to give us. We're going to say what we want, and then you're going to figure out how to give us what we want. And that's a really interesting way of doing it. You make them do their own assessments, let them take a really honest look, so they don't think you're poking around to see where their vulnerabilities are, about what they need. And then figure out how to work with them to give them what they need. This Tonga model is really interesting. If it succeeds, it's a redefinition of the relationship, which will be very helpful, I think, for moving forward with a form of development partnerships that will give China a run for its money in some of the places where it's doing other we can talk about this after if you want, but that's basically sort of a shift in the dynamic from our end, I think, would be really helpful. Do you want me to just talk quickly on Bangladesh?
Sure.
The Bangladesh situation there are no good outcomes, right? The question is, how bad an outcome will it be? And it's a bit of a subset of general geopolitical relationships. So right now you have a situation where Bangladesh refugees are going into refugee camps, and because Bangladesh is becoming a bit of a soft core client state of China, and as a result Pakistan, there's increasing radicalization in those camps. So the Indian wall goes up. And it's a very porous border, but the Indian wall is up, and they see those refugees as an immediate security threat. These aren't environmental refugees; these are infiltrators from the Indian point of view. If you see a change in the relationship between India and China, China theoretically will probably reduce pressure on client state Pakistan to radicalize those elements in Bangladesh. So you may see a reduction in that sort of perception for those environmental refugees. But the refugees exist very sadly and tragically within the context of the general geopolitical relationship of that area.
Brother VanDeveer?
Yeah, I'll comment on a couple of the ones that come together on the conflict potential and red. in some respects, my views about the conflict potential in some of these areas are a little old-fashioned, because it seems to me that any place where lots of money rushes, where there is almost no or historically low capacity governance, we should expect to see more exploitation, right? So I mean, so one of the things that it bothers me about, in a way, the kind of global level discourse about these things is that we keep being surprised that this is the outcome, right? And so whether that's red, whether it's a system of incentives designed to keep more trees, for a goal for which I don't even want to be characterized as a red critic. I just think it's an obvious outcome that if we don't accept that if we build an sort of framework in which large amounts of resources are flowing to places with no governance and history of exploitation of various groups or classes of people, we should expect that will be the outcome in the next system. I mean, it seems to be a very simple, clear, easy, straightforward. We shouldn't be surprised when it happens again, and yet we will be surprised when it happens again. And so one of the reasons I think these, Geoff has heard my song on this. I think one of the things we need in discussion of environment and security connections, sort of on the academic side as well and on the practitioner side, is much more clear-headed statements and thinking about the political economy of the relationship between environment and security linkages, right? From the conduct of some firms to the conduct of some state-owned firms to the conduct of some people who are the recipients of huge amounts of money, right? And so we can't be surprised when vicious exploitation and massive environmental degradation are the outcome of those circumstances. And they will, I mean, the amounts of money, I guess the last bit about, since you're USAID, you know this well, those amounts of money are going to vastly overwhelm any incentive that foreign assistance for good governance can offer, right? And here, people like Stiglitz and Collier's books have been great on this, right? You simply can't incentivize good governance with little dribbles of foreign assistance if the alternative is massive influx of capital for the benefit of a small group of people. The outcome there is clear too. The experiment has been run.
On environmental terrorism, maybe just one remark. Under the security research program of the EU, we are conducting one research project exactly on this subject, looking at past events and originating a little bit from both bioterrorism, or basically that perspective, and looking at past events. And the preliminary conclusions, this is about to be finished only in a year, this project, is that there is very little evidence that larger international operating terrorist groups really use the modification of the environment as one of the tools for several reasons, because they are very much looking at impacts, target groups, etc., and obtaining know-how and technologies maybe. But very much unexplored is the question of smaller terrorist groups, homegrown terrorist cells and lone wolves, using prescriptions and low cost and low technology options to modify ecosystems with larger effects than a local population there. And this is not part of the exercise of looking at past events, but basically at looking at a couple of scenarios that we have developed. And it's part of a further exercise, of a foresight exercise, where a couple of experts, some of them are here, also participate. So those of you who would like to read more about that are invited either to go to our website or to securenf.org and learn more about the results that will come up in the near future on that subject. It's an interesting question, but I think very unlikely at this stage. It depends a little bit on the geoengineering component, how that is developed.
Stacy, word on grasslands?
Yeah, just I skipped over that, the grasslands desertification question. I mean, this is one of the huge challenges in the global level debates about climate change, and propose solutions is to figure out how to discuss just all of the other land use changes, right? I mean, so the fact of the matter is we know that massive land use change from agricultural uses and urbanization and suburbanization, we know that these are huge drivers. We also know that they tend to be governed at a very local scale, and connecting those to the kind of ongoing sort of global regime discussion has simply not happened, actually. I mean, and seeing how it does happen is still quite mysterious to me. And again, I think that having the discussion about the role of forests has been productive, though I don't love some of the directions in which it's going. But now we talk about climate and forest connections, and still all the rest of the land use changes are almost completely absent, right? So I wish I had a better answer, but it has really been one that's hard to wrap a sort of activism around. It's one that even most of the environmental groups that we can all name globally have not really taken up. They don't really. It's not particularly sexy for some reason. So I think it's a really important point.
I just would like to make one more comment on this case of India and Bangladesh. Last year, we were the advisors to the European Commission Directorate for External Relations on this roadmap process for climate change and international security, and the European Union engaged in a series of consultations, regional consultations on the likely security implications. And what we have, and one topic that popped up in the Asian context was the question of environmentally or climate-induced migration. And my perception of how India deals with this question of insurgency, the question of mass migration that is climate-induced and perceived as a threat, and you mentioned that one reaction is then thinking about building up walls and fences, is that there is some argument that they are also delegating a problem that is considered to be a domestic problem to framework as a problem between Bangladesh and India, and that is anyway existing both labor migration and climate-induced migration within India, from poorer parts of the countries to richer parts, from urban areas to basically so rural areas to urban areas and coastal zones. And I guess that is something we have to be very careful of looking where a problem that is to a large extent a domestic problem is then created artificially, exclusively as an excuse, an interstate problem.
Okay, yeah, over here, Bill. And then gentleman in the back, 2, 3, we'll get you. Okay, good, thank you.
Thank you, this is really fascinating. Cleo mentioned that there were a bunch of meteorologists, and I'm one of them. My name is Bill Hook, and I work with the American Meteorological Society. Meteorologists have a saying, which is persistence is the best forecast. And if you want to be accurate 2/3 of the time in your weather forecast for tomorrow, just say the weather will be like today. That's not very helpful. So in listening to this rather excellent presentation of a depressing bunch of trends, if I could ask you, what is it that's likely to change these trends? Is the change going to come from leadership, from technology, from a particular place in the globe? What are your thoughts about those things that might turn some of this around?
Okay, and Anita? Go ahead. Where is it, the next one? Okay, yep, we'll cut you. I thought you had one in the back, okay. Go ahead, whoever's got it, I can't see.
So I have one, is it working?
Okay. Yes.
Okay,
Dick, go ahead.
Yeah, Dick Smith. I was the U.S. negotiator on the London Amendments to the Montreal Protocol in 1990. And I want to ask a question about where negotiations on climate change seem to be going and get your thoughts. I think something very fundamental and quite promising happened in Copenhagen, where the shift away from the basic flaw in Kyoto occurred, where there was that distinction, an invidious distinction between some countries, developed countries, which made, quote, mandatory commitments, and others that might make some voluntary commitments. And this was fundamentally moved away from in the Copenhagen Accord, where you have on the same basis, like in Montreal, the developing countries had more time to meet their commitments, but they were on the same basis. And the Copenhagen Accord moves us to that area, but I'm a little troubled by the fact that there is this, what they call a second track, which keeps the Kyoto Protocol open. And I'm wondering whether the ghost of Copenhagen is going to keep us from really making some progress, or whether we can build on what happened in the Accord and really move forward on a path which not only will get us, I think, more likely to reach our goals in mitigating climate change, but also takes a lot of the tension out of the relationship between developed and developing countries. And there's a lot of other bad side effects that occur from this voluntary mandatory split that was in the Kyoto Protocol and still exists apparently on the second track. And be interested in your views.
Hi, sorry. I'm Anita Street. I'm from the Department of Energy, and I actually have more of a comment than a question. Just a point of information, discussions about strategic minerals and maybe the U.S. response or non-response, seemingly non-response to the issue. David Sandalo, who's the Assistant Secretary for Policy and International Affairs, announced in March that he intended to develop a strategic plan for strategic minerals. And that effort is currently underway. There was a request for information that went out publicly to gather some information about more about demand as opposed to supply. We have more information on supply and the relative distributions, if you will, and we know far less about the demand. So I just wanted to put that out there as point of information, and maybe inject a little positive note into the discussion. So.
And also reinforcing the importance of bringing the private sector into the discussion to try to anticipate where that demand is coming from.
Yes, and just to follow up on that point, obviously the urgency, the sense of urgency has been coming more from the commercial side, as you might suspect, given the profit motive. But they're eager to work with government and develop partnerships to do research on finding alternatives and other technological solutions.
And Nate, if you could hand it to, oh, you got one. Okay, great.
I'm Danny Morris. I'm with Resources for the Future. I've heard this question almost answered a few times in the discussion, but not quite. So I'd like to hear the panelists' thoughts on where does global warming, climate change, and these impacts present new challenges, and where does it simply exacerbate old challenges that have already been present? Or where does it just create a new frame for answering questions and fixing problems that we haven't had a chance to? It might not even have a huge effect on them, or it might. But where does it really create new challenges in terms of conflict and resource use and things like that? And where is it just a helpful framing mechanism to readdress some of these issues?
Okay, and then there's one down here, and then that will have to probably, we'll get these two quickly, and then that'll have to be it, give our panelists a final chance.
My name is Gami Shrestha. I'm from the University of California, Merced, today with the AMS group. My question is, I think you touched upon this earlier. Could you elaborate on collaboration with terrorist groups and extremist groups for local-scale climate change mitigation and adaptation toward the goal of poverty alleviation, equity, and peace building? So sort of reversing climate change-induced insecurity using climate change mitigation and adaptation technologies and funding mechanisms. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Meredith Waters. I'm with WADO, Women in the Environment Organization in Iraq. My question is what are the ways or mechanisms do you see in using climate change policies or environmental policies overall in a security strategy way or reconstruction and framework tool in current and post-conflict countries?
Okay. Who would like to kick us off in that? Rich, 1, 2, 3, 6 people, probably many more questions than that.
Do you want to start this time, Alexander?
Okay, I give you some time.
European friends into the breach.
Yeah. I won't reply to all of them, but I didn't know that meteorologists believe in persistence. But when you ask what makes a change, I think that's a good question. I wouldn't make a distinction between leadership, technology, policies. But I do believe in leadership, and I think that is what we actually need. We saw this in Copenhagen, that it was a lack of leadership. And we saw it last year when I made this introductory statement of some sort of proliferation of reports since 2007 on climate and security issues, not looking exclusively at on the likely or not likely security implications of climate change, but also at the peace dividend and the peace-building potential that cooperation on developing joint mechanisms to address climate change could have. And most of the initiatives that were kicked off in EU member states were kicked off not because of a large amount of scientific evidence. At least I saw that. I mean, there were a couple of reports out, and there were a couple of government agencies requesting reports from their think tanks and advisory councils. But basically, it was very much either pushed at the EU level by the High Representative for the EU, Javier Solana, and the Commissioner for External Relations at the European Council to come up with a joint paper. It was triggered by a decision under the German Council presidency. It was the then German foreign minister pushing very much into this direction for various reasons. But at least it demonstrated that you need some sort of leadership either at the domestic level or at the international level. But as I said, it's not just about leadership, because these leaders, I mean, our government has changed. The foreign minister is in opposition right now. Our current foreign minister said that the Foreign Office is not considering climate change as a priority in foreign policy terms, so it's totally different from the past government. But you need mechanisms to have mechanisms in place in order to further discuss that. And this is what I see, is that most of the mechanisms that we believed last year will kick off and sustain a debate, a resolution by the General Assembly on that subject, a report by the Secretary General of the UN on that subject, and a roadmap in place at the EU level, that basically, as I see it, everything imploded and was out or sidelined by the financial crisis earlier this year. So I think it's both. It's a mix of the system that we have in place, leadership, technology options in place, and that relates to the nuclear power option, for instance, a question of pressure. So how much alternatives do we have, and policy pressure in the development of policies in the policy cycle is always important. A second one, I will pick up only two things, is the question of whether climate change is triggering old problems, as far as I understood your question, or if that is creating new ones. I guess one thing that I have learned from the various reports that I read and efforts that allowed me to discuss that is that it's a matter of scale. It's not just triggered. Triggered sometimes assumed that there is a development going on and it is just get a little bit more complicated. No, I think what we have learned in many of the regional scenarios for Southeast Asia, for South Asia, for the Caribbean, for the small island states, is that the impacts that climate change might have on the long run, and will definitely have, and given certain scenarios for different regions, is a matter of scale, that the capacities that the international community has in place for delivering humanitarian assistance or to intervene in crisis situations. You mentioned Hurricane Katrina and a series of other hurricanes, is made to digest a couple of crises at the same time, but not anymore in 20 to 30 years from now, when these kinds of large-scale impacts on societies and countries occur all over the world. And I guess that's basically the new dimension, without going into detail of what kind of effects this has.
Cleo?
Okay. We are going through change. So we have change. So the question is who can guide us or who can help us through the change. And as was said here, all of the above, we need all hands on deck for this one. And they're interesting allies. You know, the insurance industry is potentially very helpful for assessing risk. And if we don't distort the system with things like the National Flood Insurance Program or allowing BP to self-insure, then that can actually be very helpful for guiding a sustainable form of development. Another very useful group are city planners, who are great. I mean, they don't yet have the tools to incorporate environmental change into the way they do planning, but as soon as they do, they're a really solid ally. And the Canadian Council for City Planners, whatever they are, and the UK Royal Society for City Planners are both having climate change as major themes for annual conventions this year. So, and traditionally they've been focused on mitigation, so on sort of new transportation systems. Now they're starting to look at adaptation. So I think there's a lot of really promising new venues for, but again, it's a million problems, so we need a million solutions. We need to go, and it's a matter of getting at this message that we need to deal with this. This is a new variability in the system, and it needs to be incorporated in your assessments. In terms of, let's see, in order of complication, in terms of new risks, okay, I'm going to give you a totally new risk that's coming as a result of climate change because it's often considered as just a threat multiplier, but there are some completely new situations that we haven't seen before that are happening strictly as a result of climate change. One of them is if you accept the predictions that you're going to get a sea level rise of, minimum, well, let's just say a meter and a half, you're looking at, and it may be over 100 years or 200 years, whatever, you're looking at definite evacuation of countries like Tuvalu or the Maldives. Now, this is a legal question. If the countries are physically evacuated and subsumed, do they legally cease to exist as a country? Do the waters become international waters? Do they lose their seat in the UN? And in many cases, these islands are very geostrategic. So if you look at the Maldives, for example, they're right between a major UK-US base in the Chagos Archipelago and India, and they are an entry point into the Indian Ocean, which, of course, is a critical sea lane into the Persian Gulf, and especially as the Asia-Persian Gulf route continues. So that is a problem that we haven't seen before, totally unexpected, and our systems, our legal systems are not, in the same way our physical infrastructure isn't designed to incorporate environmental change, our legal infrastructure isn't designed to incorporate environmental change. So many of our regulations around agriculture, for example, assume that the same sort of agriculture will be desirable forever. A lot of our regulations around water sharing assume the same amount of water is going to be in the rivers. It's just a matter of apportioning it out. So these sorts of issues are quite new, and we aren't really equipped to deal with them. Copenhagen. This is like the Rashomon discussion, right? Everybody's got their yeah. My view is, and I'd be really interested to hear your view, and again, I have to preface this by saying I was in India before Copenhagen because I wanted to hear what was going on within India going in. And it was a big geopolitical power move on the part of India to align with China at Copenhagen. And again, I think that a lot of the reason for that was geopolitical. And a lot of that had to do with the relationship between the U.S. and India. So moving forward, I think a lot of what we can expect from India or that track will reflect how our relationship with India is in other sectors. If India is more an ally of the U.S., then you might see an effective isolation of China on some of these issues. If not, it's very hard to say. Now, this is a really, really big discussion, but again, I think that what happened at Copenhagen became at least for the last few days, a subset of general geopolitical issues. And the Indians are not letting go of Copenhagen. Kyoto, yeah. They're keeping two tracks, right? That's what I was afraid of. Yeah. And they're very clear about that. And it's it's the cards they're playing. They're playing as many cards as they can. So I think a lot depends on what our reaction will be to that.
Not just India, but all the developing.
Yeah.
I mean, that was one of the big rubs in Copenhagen was keeping the Kyoto track alive.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's become a WTO type situation, right? So anyway, and just very quickly about the stability thing, and environmental change or environmental assessments need to be incorporated into reconstruction, or else you have an unstable foundation for your infrastructure, period. I mean, we need to do it. Everybody else needs to do it. You need to be incorporating environmental change into your assessments around water supply, where you build your infrastructure, how you build your infrastructure, or else it's all going to be, your reconstruction is not going to be a source of stability. It'll be a source of disruption.
Would you say that's where you see a combination of doing conflict assessment, combining that with an environmental assessment, and seeing the fusion of the two?
Sure.
And go to search post-conflict and disaster branch, UNEP, online, and find a lot of
great stuff.
Very systematic work on that stuff. Because we're over time, Stacy, you want to? No, it's fine. It's good stuff. But you want to give you a final word?
I'll start with the ghosts of Kyoto. I mean, I have to say that it's one of those things where I am amazed that. I mean, only in Washington do people believe that progress was made on something in Copenhagen, right? and only in Washington do they believe that mostly India and China were the problem, right? The fact of the matter is the two biggest emitters do not want to curb their emissions. And the person and administration to whom the world looked for leadership absolutely failed to offer it. I mean, there's no other... so yeah, there were, yes, if you line up, and I have done this, I sadly publish such things. If you line up the array of 20 issues on the table, and you can say there's incremental progress here, and they came closer together there, and all this kind of stuff. But the fact is, they ripped down the global architecture by rejecting Kyoto, which you endorse, right, and have replaced it with nothing. And no one, except for our friends in Brussels, who have a rhetorical strategy, no one expects that they're going to be moved toward mandatory. It's like nothing, right? So in fact, it's the worst possible outcome in Copenhagen because it was a total disaster in terms of a commitment to do anything, and no one seems to notice, right? So there we is. So we have no global regime and no hope of one, and no hope of the current administration leading us toward one, and no hope of another leader emerging. So that would be my sense of the Copenhagen regime.
How do you really?
Exactly. Anita, on DOE, my thing about DOE, the first two comments are grumpy, the second two are more hopeful, I guess. The thing about the DOE process is it seems to me that it's likely to be premised almost entirely on, can we in this country get access to what we want? Right? And so the extent to which other things like resource curse sort of issues and governance issues, there will be there, and they'll be kind of in the final report. That would be my prediction. But the fact of the matter is it's about access, right? And so the extent to which our access to those rare earths, that strikes me as probably not an advance on thinking about the connections between environmental change and security and rare earths. I mean, that would be my fear of it. If it engenders more discussion in Washington, I think that would be fantastic, of course, right? But I think the frame there will be our access, in quotation marks. The change question, I think we have run the experiment of waiting for the most recent Messiah to lead us toward a more clear action on climate change. So I think that experiment has been run. So I think we have to go back to figuring out where leadership and change comes from all manner of places, not just from one high place. And so that dynamic, I think we return to the fact that many firms and many local governments and many state governments are trying to do something, and we can learn from those experiments and keep moving forward. And then on the old versus new problems. On the one hand, from a political theory perspective, there isn't anything in climate change that the Greeks didn't write about, right? So if we think about them in terms of this being about human exploitation and governance and, freedoms and liberties and prosperity, then of course there are no new issues. But I think when you get down from that level, then you do have a number of new ones. Cleo mentioned one, but I would say that in general, climate change is in a small number of issues, I think now, in which we really are, we grapple with how to actually govern ourselves at a global level. And that's not an incidental challenge, as has been demonstrated, so I wouldn't minimize the challenge to that. But, the fact is, if we think about the markets the sort of market exploitation dynamics that have come up today or climate change, we're talking about how to figure out how to better govern global supply chains, global movements of people, global movements of images and money. And that bit, it seems to me, at the scale level is quite new.
Well, we got our money's worth plus 15 minutes. So with being 15 minutes over, I want to thank all of you for sticking with us and having some excellent questions, some challenging ones that clearly ranged across a lot of topics, perhaps not surprisingly since we set this up to range across a lot of topics. I want to thank our three panelists for your insights and willingness